chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening. You're listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark. Welcome, dear listeners, to Season 16, Episode 8. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and here as well is my neighbor, Malcolm Blackwood.
Hello, dear listeners. I hope you are well this evening.
And in this episode, we'll be performing 5 tales to terrify you, courtesy of authors Nick Carlson, Hyde Price, Craig Groshek, Finn McCool, and Z.J. Bolin. Today we'll hear stories of unpleasant unguents, naughty nanits, horrific hearing, sinister sprays, and ill illuminations. You're listening to the standard edition of tonight's program, which contains the first 3 spine-tingling stories. If you'd like to show your support and enjoy an extended version of this and other episodes with twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today. Thank you for your support.
Your support is most deeply appreciated, and nothing warms our cold, unmoving hearts quite so much as providing more terror than you can take in one sitting.
Now, it's time to take a walk together down the moonlit trail. So lock your doors, turn your lights down low, and settle in. The show is about to begin.
Hello, neighbor. I hope you're having
Feeling under the weather?
a little. Better under the weather than under the ground, though. I believe it might be a touch of allergies. I was once told I had hay fever, but that seems suspect. When I had a barn, I had hay in there all the time, and it never bothered me.
Had a barn? What'd you keep in there? Chickens? Cows?
Let's just say meat and leave it at that. But you seem hale and hearty.
Well, appearances can be deceiving. Sure, I get plenty of exercise, but I also make sure to eat right, get plenty of sleep, and of course, take over-the-counter pain relievers as needed.
How many do you take?
Why, it all depends on how hurt I get. Some victims just don't stop kicking. But you know, I hear tell from some friends of mine that they too have some tales to tell of when they rely on some product to fix up their lives or their health, and wouldn't you know it, it's a lemon. Or, really, a lemon if they're lucky. Imagine if that lemon had vines that acted like arms and razor-sharp teeth.
Ouch! The teeth are bad enough, but getting lemon juice in the wound at the same time.
Indeed. Well, how about this? If you've ever had a skin condition, perhaps you can identify with the young lady in our first tale, courtesy of Nick Carlson. She's just looking for relief from itchy, flaky skin, and she just may have found it in a hard-to-find topical cream. Of course, you may want to check to see how out of date it happens to be. Without further ado, I present to you Dermachosis. It was back. That much was apparent on account of the dried blood underneath Katie's fingernails. The pressure in her head from waking up too early was overwhelming, nauseating, yet she forced herself to squint at her phone. 6:14 a.m. She still had over an hour to get ready. Even in the dim glow of the screen, she could see those dark smudges on her nails. Then the searing kicked in. She pulled down the neck of her t-shirt, staring disgustedly at the dry, inflamed patch of skin the size and shape of a fist on her chest. Eczema ran in Katie's family, induced by stress and hormones. It had first flared up in her teenage years, another disquieting physical side effect of a rapidly changing body. Nearly a decade's worth of doctor's visits, creams and ointments, prescription medications, and even holistic treatments had failed to curb the rash. Every time it flared up, she resisted. An internal battle would rage and scream while she struggled to keep a straight face, focusing on anything else in the world other than that crawling, itching sensation, like 1,000 ants with needle points for feet, marching in and around her skin. But still, she found herself scratching. She'd scratch when she wasn't thinking about it, her attention set on more important things, like the exam she was taking. She'd scratch in her sleep. Soon, that patch became scaly and scarred, a permanent marker of her genetic curse. The older Katie got, the more she supposed it could be worse. She wasn't self-conscious of it, not to the point where she couldn't wear low-cut tops, and she knew from her college bio courses that there were at least 1 million afflictions more grievous than eczema. You'll get used to it, her mother had assured. But the number of times Katie caught her furiously itching the back of her head, sucking air through gritted teeth, told her that was just wishful thinking. Her Aunt Bella had it between her fingers. It made her job as an office worker a living hell. She'd arrived at a grim conclusion on her own. Living with it and getting used to it were not the same thing. Now, as her eyes adjusted to the low light, she could see dark liquid flecks staining the white cotton of her t-shirt. The swollen skin had spread, half-inch in all directions, from that worn, tired patch. But it would recede within an hour if she just left it alone. The urge to just cut the skin off, peel it like a goddamn potato, wildly crossed her mind. But she sighed, rolling out of bed and lowering onto the floor. She was awake for the day. Her roommate, Jenna, stirred a few feet away. Katie crept to the sink and stared into the mirror. From this angle, the front of her shirt looked even worse, like someone had driven nails into her ribs and let the blood flow freely. She tugged angrily at the neck, scrunching the fabric. Another one for the trash. Stress from midterm exams had made it worse, obviously. And Alex, there was no forgetting about Alex. By the end of her second exam of the day, Katie was almost in tears. A flare-up had struck up with a vengeance, and she spent her last 5 minutes frantically scribbling a worthwhile conclusion to her essay. Just get to the goddamn point, she admonished, eyes scrunched shut and a free hand flexing. She turned in her paper, striding nonchalantly out the door. Out of sight, she broke into a run and dove into the girls' bathroom. Mercifully, she was alone. She pulled down her shirt and saw the patch was rosy red, silently begging for a scratch, just a little scratch, to satiate that psychotic sting. Cursing to herself, Katie fumbled with her bag and pulled out a worn bottle of calamine lotion, applying a glob onto her chest. She rubbed it in, counting to 10 in her mind. With calamine, she swore she felt relief sometimes. It could have been a placebo, though. Better not to think too much about it. She pounded the sink with a fist. The smell of the lotion wasn't unpleasant, but it was familiar in a way that brought evocations of fruitlessness, an aromatic calling card of her condition. A toilet flushed and the stall behind her opened. Catching sight in the mirror, Katie pulled herself together and threw a faucet on, pretending to busy herself with hand-washing. Its occupant pulled up to her right, washing her hands too. She was a short, sturdy girl with raven hair and a pinched face. Katie could envision her playing guitar with some traveling hippie commune. But she paid no further attention, depositing some hand soap on her palms. "You itching?" the girl said. Katie looked at her. Excuse me? "I was watching you," the girl explained. "That's a nasty rash you got." "Oh." Katie threw a strap over her shoulder, ignoring the fact that she was being spied on by someone through a crack in a stall. "It's hereditary. I've tried everything." "How about dermatitis?" Katie blinked. "I never heard of that one before." "Oh, it's awesome stuff," the girl said. "My mom got hives a few years back. A few scrubs of dermatitis, boom, never again. I got poison ivy this summer. Dermatitis, boom, gone." "Wow," said Katie. "What makes it so effective?" "Stuff like calamine and technu just mask the itch," the girl explained. "Dermatitis actually treats the skin. It goes in and cures the skin cells that are itching. Whatever's making them irritate and turn all red, it fixes it." "How does it do that?" Katie asked, now intrigued. "It's fungal-based," said the girl. "And don't freak out. Lots of medicines are derived from fungi. This one, disrupts the skin cells that are itching and makes them stop producing the proper molecules." She shrugged. "Not sure of the specifics. I'm not a scientist." "Never heard of anything like that before," said Katie, looking away. "But I did know about fungi in medicine. Makes sense. Where can I get some?" "I've only seen it in a few stores," the girl admitted. "All back home, too. Don't know what here's got it." She dried her hands off and tossed the paper towels in the trash. "Anyway, I gotta run now, but I hope you find some. Seriously, makes all your problems go away." The girl shouldered her backpack and scuttled out the bathroom door, and Katie was alone again, save for the running faucet and the buzz of overhead lights, and the surprise flare-up that made her skin crawl. Her hand jumped to her chest, fingers clawed in a scratching motion. She forced herself to stop. It all seemed so sudden, some bizarre prank. Maybe she'd misheard, but the brand name stuck. Dermatitis. She looked in the mirror. A patch of crimson was peeking above the neck of her shirt. She grimaced. If the opportunity to cleanse herself of the family curse was just a few dollars and a scrub away. Besides, she realized as she hitched up her backpack and departed the bathroom, maybe getting rid of such a distinctive marker would be a good thing if the result of Alex's transgressions had spread as far as she'd feared. "Damn you," she thought, hurrying to her next class. "You did this to me. You made me do this." She found dermatitis well past 7 in the evening, after 3 hours of making phone calls and scouring convenience stores on the fringes of town. Under the flickering fluorescent lights of a seedy gas station grocer, Katie had spotted the first few letters sticking up behind a shelf of over-the-counter topical cream. Shifting the clean white boxes aside, she plucked the dermatized container from its shadowy haunt and examined the label. The cardboard was frayed and the colors had faded. Katie swiveled it in her grasp, looking for an expiration date. Whatever serial numbers had once marked the packaging were smudged off. She studied it further, weighing the risks. The electronic buzz persisted overhead. The dead cockroaches in the fixtures loomed like predators in ambush. Her empty stomach gave a rumble. Uncertainty curled into anxiety, and the rash seared in response. She took the dermatized to the counter with a huff. The man behind the register peered blearily at the box, overturning it, looking for a barcode. This was in the store? Yes, with the topical creams, Katie confirmed. Finally, the cashier shrugged and rung up the box as merchandise, charging her a grand total of $6. Katie scooped up the box and strode hastily back to her car outside. A hoodie-clad drifter gave her a lecherous look as she slipped into her front seat. Desperate, aren't you? She thought bitterly, glancing down at her drab sweatpants and overlarge shirt. Honestly, I look like a goddamn potato sack. The rash burned like a steam iron pressed onto her chest on the drive home, as if it were dreading its fate and clamoring in protest. Katie refused to scratch out of pure spite. You're gone, she relished, clenching her jaw. You'll be gone by tomorrow. Apply to affected area. Rub for 15 to 20 seconds. Do not wet the affected area after treatment for 24 hours. The directions are read succinctly. Katie scrutinized the labels further for addendums or disclaimers, but the packaging, faded and unattended as it appeared, seemed like any other garden-variety topical cream. Staring at herself in the mirror above the sink in her dorm room, Katie removed her shirt and stared at the angry red patch on her chest. Now let's see if this actually works, she muttered. In the other bed nearby, Jenna set her book down and looked at her. What are you up to? This stuff is supposed to make my eczema go away, said Katie, removing the tube from the box. It was unlabeled and a pale leafy green. Like more than just stopping the itch, it actually cures the skin. How? Asked Jenna, sitting up. I'm not sure, she replied, opting not to delve into the mycological side of it. She squeezed a dollop onto her fingertips. It was the same color as the tubing, and it emitted a strange yet endearing aroma of lavender and latex. It says just apply it and don't get it wet for 24 hours. She lingered in the mirror for a moment, Jenna regarding her with silence. All right, then, Katie said with a shrug, lathering the cream over the rash. She counted to 17 in her head, kneading it into her skin. Smell seemed to envelop her in a shroud. How do you feel? Jenna prompted. Nothing yet, said Katie. The application looked as though she had accidentally smudged part of an herbal face mask across her skin. I guess we'll just wait overnight. Hopefully it'll be good by tomorrow, said Jenna. We're still going to that party, right? Oh, for sure, Katie confirmed, switching off the light and making her way to bed. Even if the cream didn't work and the rash persisted, that wouldn't be enough to keep her from celebrating the last day of midterms week. Katie slept peacefully that night. Her alarm went off and woke her up at her normal time. She stirred, stretching luxuriously, savoring in the unusual sense of comfort and rest. I feel great, she thought, sitting up. Then she remembered. She pulled down the neck of her shirt and peered at her chest. Nothing itched. The patch was no longer swollen. The only color, besides her own skin, was the remnants of the dermatize, which had faded into a light gray, flaky film. Her lips broke into a smile. She felt spry, confident, as if she had just shed a chainmail suit. Her final midterms of the week suddenly seemed several degrees less daunting. The thought of the party later that evening filled her with overwhelming giddiness. She had to stop herself from emitting some vocal expression of glee. And then Alex crossed her mind, and an icy blade slashed at her elated spirit. Forget him, she thought, slipping out of the bed. Something good happened to you. Cherish it. As she had hoped, her last exam was a cinch. The rash didn't flare up once. The only reminder of her condition was the diminished lavender latex scent and the strange off-color spot barely visible above her shirt. But none of that even mattered. She was cured. She was free. The days ahead were bright and bountiful, and all of that was long-term. Short-term, there was a party to attend to. Katie and Jenna pulled up outside the host's house at 7 that evening. Multicolored lights gleamed in the windows, and heavy bass thundered in the ground like shifting tectonic plates. Katie glanced at her low-cut red dress as she exited the passenger seat. The ointment had almost faded entirely. Under the low, colorful lights, no one would even notice it was there. She smiled again as she and Jenna stepped through the front door and into the fray. Greetings were exchanged, outfits were doted over, conversations had to be shouted above the music. Ping-pong balls clicked and clattered to sporadic cheers and jeers, and the booze flowed like a mythical fountain. By her second vodka tonic, Katie was swept in a whirlwind of dizzying bliss, dancing and reveling and socializing as if it were her last day. She joined in on a game of beer pong paired with some guy she hadn't seen before. They won, but she still had to take a few shots before victory could be sealed. He was pretty cute, she thought, making her way to the refreshments table for a cup of water. Her head was fuzzy, and there was a brick in her stomach from the alcohol. Maybe I can get back into it soon enough. "Katie!" A voice called over the noise. Katie turned. "Oh, hey, Pamela," she replied, watching her blonde friend from Anthropology 101 weave her way to the table. "Didn't know you were here." "Nowhere better to be tonight," said Pamela, swaying to the music. "Every movie that's out this week sucks." "Seriously," Katie agreed, taking a cooling drink. "How many of those pulverizer films have they made so far?" "Hey, if the psychopaths keep coming, they'll keep providing," Pamela answered, and they both laughed. "But seriously," she continued, "are you doing all right?" "Yeah," said Katie, mulling her cup in her grasp. "I'm just trying not to dwell on it too much." "What a scumbag," Pamela said, shaking her head. "Honestly," said Katie. "But in other news, I managed to make my—" She trailed off. Pamela stared at her concernedly. "I'm sorry, you what?" But Katie ignored her. Something had caught her eye, a flash of color in the crowd that struck her, digging up old wounds. She scanned the rolling mass of heads in the living room, and she saw it. A young, pale man with red hair and dark, narrow eyes, hanging out by the stairwell and talking to some other guy. "He's here," Katie said lowly. Pamela turned around. Oh my God. Come on, let's get out of here." "No, I gotta find Jenna. Hold on." But Katie could hardly focus on the partygoers, much less pick out Jenna's nondescript brown hair among them. "I don't see her." She reached for her phone, but then she paused. A flame had sprouted in her heart. She hadn't talked to him since he'd found out what he'd done, nor did she even want to see him again. The shame was too much, but the fresh anger inside was almost refreshing. Newfound, indignant, just. She had overcome one malaise in her life. She could put another to bed. "Now, hold this, please," she said, passing her cup to Pamela. "What are you doing?" her friend hissed, but Katie slipped her way through the crowd toward Alex. "Hey, asshole," she spat, stopping next to him. Alex froze mid-sentence and looked at her. What was that for?" "A little bird told me what you've been doing," said Katie in a loud voice. The guy he was conversing with snickered and walked away. "With all those girls you talk to." "Hey, you want to keep it down?" said Alex, swiveling fully around, "so we can talk this out like adults?" "No, this is fine," said Katie. "What's not fine is using girls' pictures to catfish." A few curious heads turned to listen. Alex's eyes narrowed further. "That's none of your business. None of this concerns you." "It totally concerns me," Katie hissed, her voice lowered with humiliation. "You had no right to use me like that. My body on your scam accounts." "I hide the faces," Alex muttered dimly. "No one knows it's you unless you speak up." Katie gestured madly below her neck. "Have a mark right here," she whispered. "Anybody who knows me and sees that knows it's me. Do you not understand that?" He grimaced. "Look, I didn't force you to send those pictures. You weren't even into me, yet you had it in you to follow through." Yeah, I was an idiot," said Katie, her voice trembling. "But that doesn't matter now. You're through." Alex chortled. "Oh, please. Save it for the playground, you child." Fury exploded inside her. She slapped him across the face. He staggered against the banister, a pink mark gleaming on his cheek. He scrambled for something on a nearby nightstand. He growled, hurling his cup at her. Rank liquor splashed across her face and chest, soaking the front of her dress. Taken aback, Katie gasped and stepped backward, right into another partygoer whose foot tangled with hers. It was as if some giant invisible hand flung her sideways, limbs and fabric flew in and out of her vision, and suddenly she was on the floor, the back of her skull connecting with the hardwood floor. Pain exploded. Her vision went blurry, and welling intoxication only made the world spin underneath her. Amid the chaos and flurry of voices, there was a fresh, liquid coolness on her face, her chest. Someone else had spilled their drink. "Just pour the entire water cooler on me," she thought as she floundered on the floor. Faces and outstretched hands swam into view. Someone grabbed her underarms and hoisted her to her feet. Her head hung limply for a second. Then the voices came through. Katie, are you all right?" Where is that?" Katie slurred, inaudible over the music. "Katie, look at me," Pamela urged, locking eyes with hers. "Are you hurt?" Just my head," said Katie lowly. "Where's that asshole?" "Where is he?" "Gone. Just picked up and left," said Pamela bitterly. Katie lunged for the door, but a few partygoers held her back. The dizziness came back, and she became aware of a stickiness on the back of her head that could only have been blood. The front of her dress was similarly damp, and it reeked of sour drink. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up," said Pamela, keeping her steady. "Hey, is the shower free?" she shouted. "All right, this way, Katie." The rest of the night was a whirlwind of voices, nausea, running water, and anger. Katie vaguely recalled being driven back to her dorm room and crawling defeatedly into bed. As her brain settled into a drowsy stupor, her only thought was the silver lining that at least the rash hadn't returned. She awoke on her own well past 10 in the morning. She never set her alarm for Friday mornings, considering she only had one 11 a.m. class, although she usually trusted herself to wake up much earlier than now. She slipped out of bed, then blinked rapidly. No hangover. no crust in her eyes. She felt alert, like she'd been awake for half the day. "Huh?" she said out loud. "Oh, what's up?" Jenna said from her bed, settling her book down. "How are you feeling?" "Great," said Katie uncertainly. "Wait, seriously?" Jenna inquired, sitting up. "Apparently you got in some fight with a guy, then you fell and hit your head. You're not feeling any pain?" "Nope," said Katie with a shrug. "Did you see it happen?" "No, I was," Jenna trailed off. "I met a guy there." "Oh, for the..." Katie scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Well, my friend Pamela got me cleaned up, so thank God for her." "I'm sorry," said Jenna sheepishly. "Let me buy you breakfast." "Well, that's fine. I'm not hungry," said Katie, suddenly realizing how strange it was she wasn't the slightest bit famished after a long night of drinking and exertion and waking up so late. In fact, the thought of food made her cringe. "I'm just gonna get to class now." "What were you fighting with that guy about anyway?" Jenna asked. Clouds billowed in Katie's chest. Subconsciously, her hand crept up to her chest. A peculiar sensation followed, something dry and crusty against her fingertips. She looked down to find the Dermatize application had taken on a brown color and was peeling off. The skin underneath was pale and featureless, with the slightest hint of green. "Katie," Jenna prompted, "you good?" Son of a bitch. I showered last night, she realized, still transfixed on her flesh. Had it been 24 hours? I hope this goes away. "I think so," she said, getting dressed and grabbing her backpack. "I'll see you around." The door nearly clipped her heel as she whipped her way into the hall. She cursed to herself later in the classroom. He did this. He messed me up and led to this. The pallid stain on her chest was indeed a lighter, translucent shade of the Dermatize. Images of moldy bread and mildew on shower curtains and creeping slime molds crossed her mind. The water made it change. God damn it. She prodded at the skin. It felt no different from the rest of her flesh. Maybe it was just staining, discoloration from exposure to water before the time limit. At least it wasn't itching. Stop worrying, she urged herself. That sort of worrying made it as bad as it was. God forbid she broke out elsewhere on her body and she had to apply Dermatize again. Alex's smug, ratty face appeared in her mind next. Shame and embarrassment had kept her down. Anger for being so open with a guy she had just met. Humiliation at the ugly rash on her body that had branded her, even if he did hide the faces. But the indignation she now felt was hot, boiling venom in her blood. This shouldn't have happened. I'm not safe. I'm still being used. Pamela had been the whistleblower, the one who discovered that local college girl's photos were being used to swindle horny men out of their money. Alex had apparently been using fake profiles himself, ghosting the girls he'd talked to once he had what he'd needed. She'd been a victim herself, but somehow she put two and two together and connected a face to the scam. Truly, thank God for her. With finals over and the weekend imminent, there was nothing stopping Katie from finally taking action. She'd assumed embarrassment was keeping the other victims down as well, and Alex had at least been competent in covering his tracks, until now. Once classes let out for the day, she would. Katie gave a massive hacking cough. A flurry of white, fluffy down erupted from her mouth and fluttered across her desk. The entire class turned to face her. To them, she might have ripped up a pillow and sent feathers flying everywhere. But they stared at her with wordless, baffled shock. "Katie?" the professor inquired, similarly dumbstruck. Katie rose shakily to her feet. Her throat was scratchy and dry. She could feel more of that substance adhered to the meat inside her trachea, brewing another explosive cough. Her limbs shook as her stomach dropped, realizing what had just come out of her. A hand glued to her mouth, Katie bolted out of the classroom, knocking over an empty desk along the way. She threw herself into the nearest bathroom, uncaring of anyone else's presence, and coughed violently into the sink, caking it with mouthfuls of spores. She could feel them seeping up her throat, germinating faster than she could expel them. Still, she doubled over and emitted some grating, spasming noise from her lungs. Spores, mold, fungus, water. "Oh my God," she choked up, tearing up. "Oh my God." "Hey, are you okay?" a voice from an occupied stall said. "Shut up," Katie wheezed. "Shut up." She ran the faucet and swallowed handfuls of water, washing the spores into a slurry to give her encrusted throat some respite. The fluid traveled down her esophagus, and she could feel it draining, through her limbs, gurgling and flowing like a trickling creek. She straightened up, her joints popped like the wet, ripping crunch of celery, and a new sensation flared. A curdling, tingling rave on her chest, like a million microscopic chewing mouths. She tore off her shirt from her body and plunged her fingertips into the greenish patch on her chest. They sank. They sank into her flesh. Seized with manic, blinding hysteria, she curled her fingers and pulled apart. Her skin split down the middle. Her ribs swung outward like doors on hinges. The noise was snorting, crackling, rusty. She was looking at herself in the mirror, her insides on full display, but there was nothing there. Nothing but a hollow, greenish catacomb of fungal tendons and cobwebs, flapping and shuddering with every breath she took. Katie screamed, but no voice came out, just spores. Jenna squinted at the minute labels on the Dermachosis container. Her roommate had been acting unusually cagey about it, and she couldn't determine a process for how it actually accomplished what it alleged to do. The box also seemed worn, old, and cheap, like a knockoff brand of a knockoff brand. But she supposed if she had rashes as bad as Katie's, she'd resort to any treatment she could herself. Still, the packaging's age, plus the warning to not wet the applied area, had caught her attention. Jenna turned to her laptop and searched for Dermachosis. The company name on the box, Companion, had no official website. The term Dermachosis itself only had a handful of references across blogs and informal medical forums. Sitting cross-legged on her bed, Jenna scoured through the few relevant web pages. Anonymous users sang the product's praises, posting before and after pictures of their eczema, contact dermatitis, hives that had supposedly been cured by the miracle ointment. The posts were all from several years prior, emphatically positive and sloppily worded, no semblance of introspection or inquiry. Frowning, tried another web page. She found a blog next alleging Dermachosis was a fungal-based product, one that utilized a genetically altered strain of Poconia, designed to funnel its mycelium into inflamed human skin cells and inhibit the production of histamine. It was all Greek to her, but she understood enough to be put off. The associated account had no profile picture and only had one post to its credit. Jenna returned to the search engine and added the words water and wet. She found a post on a holistic health forum, a user, allegedly a mother, showing pictures of what looked like a small boy's arm. A faded green patch was melded to the child's small bicep. "Really don't get it wet after use," the accompanying text asserted. My son went swimming the morning after using Dermatize, and this happened. The spores in the cream must have bloomed. It went away after 3 days. He's fine now, but it still scared me." Her pulse ticking, Jenna examined the user's profile. The rest of her posts were benign and unrelated to Dermatize or her son. Unsightly, but it shouldn't be a serious issue, she concluded, returning to the results page. She was about to close out when she noticed one last result at the bottom of the page. The word Dermatize amid a post typed out in Spanish. Her stomach gave a twinge at the number of exclamation points. She clicked it. The form appeared to originate out of a Hispanic country. The UI looked decades old. The top post was a wall of unbroken text, almost every sentence punctuated with exclamation points. The browser offered to auto-translate, but she didn't need it to recognize its frantic, fearful tone, nor a few choice, glaring words. Aqua, expira, eruption. The post was accompanied with an image behind a spoiler tag. Jenna took a breath and clicked it. A solid minute passed. She stared with awe. Then it hit her, and bile rose in her throat. Distracted by the burning, acrid taste and the sublime horrors plastered on her laptop screen, she hadn't realized her phone was ringing. "Are you Katie's roommate?" the girl at the other end said. "Yes," Jenna confirmed in a small voice. "You have to come down here. Something's wrong with her." Jenna arrived unseen, gasping, a stitch in her side. A convoy of campus police and a gaggle of curious onlookers was gathered outside the women's restroom in the Smithson Academic Building. The officers muttered into their radios, forming a loose semicircle around the door. The students stood on their toes and craned their necks to get a better look. In the classroom, across from them, another group of students hovered in the doorway nervously. "Jenna?" a blonde girl said, breaking away from the crowd. "Yeah," said Jenna, catching her breath. "I'm her roommate. Who are you?" "Pamela. I'm in a class with her." She gestured toward a trepidatious mass huddled in the classroom. "That class." "What happened?" Jenna said, staring at the bathroom door. Horrid visions flashed in front of her, that grainy photograph she'd seen on the forum, unwillingly projected it onto Katie. "She's sick or something," Pamela relayed, rubbing her arm. "She coughed up some... I don't know. She was acting crazy and she ran into the bathroom. And now the door is sealed and there's some other girl in there." She motioned toward the officers. "I think they're trying to say it's a hostage situation." "No," Jenna shook her head frantically. That's not it. She used some medication for her rashes. The product she got had expired. That, plus water, it messed her up. It's going to." She hadn't the words to describe what she'd seen. "She's gone. Everyone's in danger." "What are you talking about?" Pamela demanded. "What's happening to her?" "Disperse," an officer called out, gesturing the crowds away. "Please exit the building." "Wait," Jenna yelled. "Don't open the door, she's..." Once more the words escaped her, but she was swept away in the crowds. "She's contagious," she shouted above the fray. But a handful of officers was herding them outside the building, standing guard at the doorway. Police cars were piled on the sidewalk, surrounded by more onlookers. "You can't go in there," said Jenna, breaking away and striding up to the officers blocking the entrance. "She's contagious. You'll all get infected." "Do you know her?" one said, gesturing behind him. "Yes, she..." Her cell phone vibrated. In a frenzied instinct, she whipped it out and stared at the caller ID. She looked back up at the officer, his expression stony and blank. Jenna answered the phone, putting it on speaker. The sounds of Rushing water filled the background. Then came a spine-tingling serenade of hoarse, rattling breath. "Katie?" Jenna said tentatively. The voice on the other end sounded filtered through a corpse, moist and rank, congested with phlegm, gravel, and gruel. "Jenna! You're Jenna!" "Katie," Jenna whispered. "Are you okay?" "We're in control." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Who's we?" Jenna asked. "This body. Us. Control." "Help!" An unfamiliar voice, tinny and distorted, belted from the phone. "Please help me." "Katie, who is that?" said Jenna on the verge of tears. "Let her go, please." "We saw the light and drank from the well and now we're in control." A smile was latent on Katie's voice, something crusty and sick. "We want you to feel it too." "What the are—" But the unfamiliar, hysterical voice was cut off by an upsurge of vegetative movement. Sputtering and choking followed. "Katie!" Jenna screamed into her phone as the officers tensed. "Join us. You're my friend." Katie's voice purred. "This is heaven. This is mercy." An ear-splitting crunch followed, and the call dropped. 10:33, S44A. An officer barked into his walkie. SWAT unit. Jenna's hand fell to her side. Her phone a burning brick in her grasp, too defeated to protest. The officers mobilized, shutting her out. She melded back with the crowd. Within minutes, an armored truck appeared on the scene, depositing a squadron of black-clad SWAT officers. They toted a battering ram as they marched up the steps into the building. "Oh, God," Jenna whispered, looking away while the rest of the gatherers moved forward, held back by officers and barriers. There was no morbid desire to catch a glimpse of what they'd find. It was burned into her brain. "I can't be around here when they breach it." Stricken with tears, Jenna turned and fled. She stayed up through the night, huddled in her bed, eyes glued to her phone, refreshing local news sites and bulletins and social media for word of the incident from earlier that day. SWAT team called for a hostage situation in Smithson. I heard a girl was sick with something. I was in class with her. She coughed up dust. "It's happening. Seek forgiveness." Some other girl was talking to the cops. "Does anyone know where to find her?" They brought out something on a stretcher. A knock at the door. Jenna jolted. It was the third time someone had come around to her dorm room, probably seeking answers, but she ignored them each time. She was a sweaty, clammy mess. Her stomach was eating itself alive with guilt. Her sore eyes burned from staring at the tiny prism of light in the darkness of her room. She hadn't gotten Pamela's number. She didn't know any of Katie's family. The two were friends, but not that close. If Katie's parents hadn't been informed already, they were probably asleep, blissfully unaware of the eldritch fate that had fallen upon their daughter. The box of Dermachosis sat innocently on the sink, gleaming bright in the dusty gloom. She stared at it angrily, her vision blurring with tears. It was evil, broken. It had made Katie into that evil, broken. A fourth knock. Jenna yelped and jolted again. "Hey, Jenna, are you in there?" She shook her head, wordlessly. She thought she'd vomit if she opened her mouth. "It's Laura, your RA," the voice continued. "Are you okay?" Jenna pulled the covers over her head and pressed them against her ears. Her mouth was buried in her pillow. She forced her face into it and screamed until she saw stars. Eventually, fatigue and emotional scourging won out, and Jenna fell into a fidgety, weary sleep. Knock, knock, knock. Her eyes opened immediately. She could feel in her bones it was still nighttime, but looking around, everything seemed bright as day. The anxiety from earlier wormed its way in, coiling inside her, heavy and nauseous. Knock, knock, knock. Go away, Jenna croaked. There was silence. Then the locked doorknob rattled. Jenna pulled the covers to her nose, stricken with a flash of fear. The silence returned. Her heartbeat was like a deep, ticking primordial clock. Another door down the hallway opened, the one next to their dorm, connected by the Jack and Jill bathroom. Jenna whimpered. Something lurched through the bathroom, pushing the unlocked doors open. One squelching footstep followed by the dry, heavy grind of something being dragged behind it. She curled into a ball, her eyes peeking over the fabric. It emerged from the bathroom, crested with a branching fungal crown. Its lower jaw distended down to its stomach. Eye sockets from multiple human skulls peering sightlessly from the molded rosette that was once a face. Sails and tendrils and protrusions, endowed throughout its misshapen form like the whims of a mad artist. It was different from the image Jenna had seen on the forum, but it was familiar. Undoubtedly the same process, the same species. And once more she stared at it, frozen with awe, the stupefied, mind-shredding shock of gazing upon the face of God. It hoisted itself onto the bed. Jenna could make out its victim clustered around the head. Pamela, the blonde girl she'd seen, unaltered and alive at the Smithson building mere hours earlier. Another girl she didn't know, perhaps the unfortunate hostage in the bathroom, screaming through her phone. Katie at the center of it. Its bald, lichen-gilded face peered straight at Jenna. It straddled her. It placed its hands, its fingers trailing like viney jellyfish tentacles, on Jenna's head. The infection numbed her flesh. It sent pathogen spores coursing through her blood like foot soldiers. There was warmth, electric, liquid, sensual. Its voice emanated from its many orifices. Control your body. Control. Jenna wheezed through a mouthful of hyphae and spores. We have control. Your body. Gray matter dripped down her spine like candle wax. You have control, Jenna muttered. We have control over our body. Jenna sighed, her guts roiled and converted, her limbs dried and branched. She was mold, beautiful and enlightened. I see the light. We, it corrected. We see the light. We drank from the well. They were whole, intimate, ravenous, one. Now, they said, one body heavier, lowering back onto the floor. Now we find the boy. Folks, are you looking for something haunting? Something that'll leave you feeling anxious, hanging on to every word, like you're hovering between life and death? Well, I've got quite the show for you. The Mr. Ballin Podcast. Strange, dark, and mysterious stories. You'll hear tales of the most unusual that will leave you waiting breathlessly for the final twist. Tales like the lady who woke up from a nightmare where what she saw was more than just a random dream. Or the violinist who disappeared without a trace from an orchestra pit in front of an audience of thousands, or the mark at a crime scene that led investigators to believe there were cultists in their community. Where can you hear these? Why, you can follow on your favorite podcasting platform, but you lucky Prime members can listen early and ad-free through the Amazon Music app. The Mr. Ballin Podcast. Strange, dark, and mysterious stories. I invite you to come in, sit a while, and enjoy, if you think you can handle it. I hope you enjoyed Dermachosis by Nick Carlson, as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Nick-Carlson. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/NICK-CARLSON. This isn't the first time he's talked about plants. Go back and check out his story, Mandragora, which appeared back in Season 14, Episode 2. Be sure to check out his work at this site, nickcarlsonpress.com as well. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author. And if you are watching on YouTube and are enjoying this episode, please give a like, a comment, and be sure to spread the word on your favorite social media. Listeners like you are how we keep this place going, and we appreciate each and every one of you.
I think they just need to fix the marketing on their product. Just add water, and you and your friends will be inseparable.
Not bad, not bad. Anything else you can think to advertise?
Well, how about a nice pleasant story from Hyde Price? You know, everyone is looking towards the future. And how about a time where you can just go to the store and buy your own little medical facility for use right in your own home? Imagine millions of little doctors curing you without even having to leave your home. Surely nothing can go wrong with that, right? Settle down and settle in as I tell you the tale of Side Effects May Include. So this crap's been approved, eh? The pharmacist nodded, looking at the box with the green label. Yep, over the counter at long last. Dean Swanson hefted the box. The thing fit into the palm of his hand, and it was amazing just how far technology had come. No need for clinical doctor's visits anymore. That was the slogan that dotted the airwaves, the internet ads, the streaming services. Even though he had had ad blockers up since time immemorial, somehow these ads overrode them. Everyone was getting them. Everyone was being inundated with the news. Routine medical care, as everyone knew it, was a thing of the past. Dean bought it and brought it home. He popped open the box, and inside was a little tube, barely the size of his index finger. Nanite technology. Finally here. Little doctors doing the work the doctors could not do, fighting off diseases before they even became a problem. Unlike the chemical processes of a vaccine or antibiotic, the nanites did not destroy indiscriminately. Rather, their programming allowed for targeting of various ailments. It all depended on what you needed to deal with. Bacterial infection, they had one for that. Virus had one for that too. Each nanite pack was programmed with a specific knowledge to deal a particular malady. Bacterial infection, the orange pack handled that. Cold, flu, other virus, red pack. Chronic conditions, yellow pack. There were 2 other packs that were in the works as well. Blue for cancer, purple for chromosomal abnormalities, but they had not yet been approved for general use. It was getting people very excited, though, for dealing with some of the worst problems that plague society since time immemorial. Dean had been very suspicious of them from the get-go. After all, while he'd never read any books by Michael Crichton, he knew the guy wrote all kinds of the worst ways science could go wrong. And he vaguely remembered there was a book where a rogue cloud of nanites was out, programmed to assassinate people. No, his friends all said. there wasn't any way that could happen. They had to pass a rigorous series of tests, get the FDA stamp of approval, all that stuff. They had to be insured, to be programmed to fit the parameters exactly, because they could be sued otherwise. Dean responded with a clause in most contracts that said, due to reactions by different people that couldn't be foreseen, that most pharmaceutical companies could not be sued. But, they all said, if it were done maliciously, then you could sue, because intentionally harming people was a criminal offense. Dean remained skeptical, but read the directions on the packaging. Most of it was the standard boilerplate stuff that came on medical instructions. Do not use in a manner inconsistent with what is written here, for internal use only, do not use on an unwilling recipient. Well, that one was new anyway. The actual usage was fairly clear. Just one press against the upper arm, and the little injectors would fire the contents of the tube into his body. Though the nanites were capable of rebuilding themselves and maintaining a near infinite supply of themselves going for a very long time, there was no convincing anyone that letting them go in there forever wouldn't have some kind of detrimental effect. So, there was a compromise. The nanites would shut down after a 2-week period, at which point they would be, well, flushed out, to put it nicely. And then a new set would have to be injected. So, for people's peace of mind, it was a good thing. For the companies, always having a product to sell was too, so everyone was happy. Except Dean. He thought other people probably felt the same way, but he hadn't met any of them. No, everyone in his town that he ran into were all about the things. They hadn't been sick in months. Well, of course they wouldn't. Who got sick every other month, unless they were eating hamburgers off the ground every day? If that was happening, you had bigger problems. But there were those he couldn't deny. His mother had gotten one of the yellow ones as she had chronic arthritis. She injected it, and the little machines got to work, checking on the joints and preventing any instance of inflammation. She had picked up a basket of laundry for the first time in years without a grunt, and Dean hadn't seen her so happy in, 10 years? He's sure his father would have loved it, if his father was still alive. But no, he was up in Peaceful Acres, a cemetery at the top of the tallest hill in town. Dean wondered sometimes why anyone would bury the dead up so high, since if there was ever any kind of mudslide or natural disaster, all the bodies would start flying out of the sides of the hill and down on the road. But then, nobody asked him his opinion on public works. In fact, very few asked for his opinion at all. Dean was not what many would call a good time at a party. He was very critical of what he didn't like, made sure you knew about it, and very rarely, if ever, got out and about for public occasions. What friends he did have were pretty solid. They would have to be to put up with him. But even they told him to lighten up from time to time. Not everything needs to be scrutinized, Dean. It's okay to not worry about every little thing in the world. He continued to look down at the tiny tube in his hand and sniffed. He went out and bought the green tube because he thought he had a cold coming on. By all accounts, if he injected himself now, he'd begin to feel much, much better within about 4 hours. Their little surgical lasers firing at the viruses invading his body, making them pop like little water balloons, then cleaning up the mess and depositing the remains where they needed to go. In the meantime, it freed up the body to focus on the biological menace and build up antibodies, so even if there came a time when he didn't have the things swimming around in his bloodstream, he would still be protected against harm. No more doctors, no more vaccines, all in the palm of his hand. Dean took the tube, put it back in the box, and shoved it in a drawer. He'd live with the damn cold. "Dean, come in here for a moment." Dean sniffled and coughed once before stepping into his boss's office. He worked close enough that Bill could just lean out the door and call him in, so it wasn't that far a walk. "Close the door. Sit down. Take a load off. This won't take long." Dean grabbed a side chair as Bill settled into his. It felt awkward not sitting directly on one side of the desk or the other, but like he was waiting his turn in the principal's office, and there was the principal just sitting there in the waiting room. "Dean, are you not feeling well?" "Well, I'm sure I could be feeling—" "You know, Dean, there are remedies out now that would fix that." Bill steepled his fingers, putting his elbows on the desk. "I'm sure you have been made aware of small doc." It's hard to avoid it, sir." "And why haven't you taken it?" "Well, Just as a note, you realize there is no allergic reaction to robots floating freely inside your body, yes? They're made of stainless steel, hypoallergenic, and they're made with all synthetic parts, no fetal or animal tissues that might result in a religious objection." Dean coughed. "I understand, sir, but I didn't know it was a requirement to put a foreign object in my body if I got sick." Bill gave Dean a pleading look. It was a look that said, "Look, I've gotten complaints from people on the floor that you're spreading germs around and that it's making everyone uncomfortable. And either you go get a small doc injection and come back to work, or you go home because no one wants you here spreading germs." It was amazing how that look could say so many words, because Bill didn't even have to open his mouth to let them be known. And Dean could argue if everybody else had small doc already, that they would have no problems because his germs couldn't hurt them. But he knew it wasn't worth the fight. He needed this job. He had been let go twice over the past 5 years because of his attitude, and he couldn't afford to make people here dislike him any more than they already did. Not because he minded that they disliked him, but he didn't need them getting fed up and firing him either. "It's your choice, Dean. It's a free country." He paused for a moment. "I mean, really, there are so many jobs out there." Again he gave the look, but this time it added, "I don't make the rules here. I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for Kathy over in accounting. You know she's the one who spoke up because she always does. And I'm not giving you this look because I like you all that much either, but I'd rather have you aboard than have to look around and hire somebody else. Do you realize how annoying that process is?" Bill gave some very deep looks, Dean had to admit. "All right, Bill, I can take the hint. I'll go home." "It's not going home, Dean. It's just, take small doc. It's not that big a deal." Dean got up, and though he didn't, he had the urge to cough as loudly and obnoxiously as he could at his fellow workers. He did notice, however, that Kathy over in accounting did try to hide a little smile as he picked up his stuff and left. He went home, settled in with a can of soup and watched TV. He knew he wouldn't be paid for the remainder of the day, but it wasn't like he had anywhere to go anyway. He looked over at the drawer where the tube of small doc sat squirreled away. He blinked, staring in its direction for a moment or two, before ignoring it and returning to the TV. Dean woke up on the couch, the TV still playing, and realized he missed his alarm. He only had about 15 minutes before he had to be out the door for work. He sat up and knocked his half-eaten bowl of soup on the floor and coughed, realizing that he was freaking out for no reason. He would never be allowed into work today with his cough sounding like that. But he needed the work. His basement apartment wasn't exactly getting any cheaper. He went to turn off the TV, daytime television, talking heads, all smiles and big teeth. "Well, ladies, can we talk about what's going on in—" He shut it off, coughed again, and looked at the time. He picked up his phone to call the office. It rang about 4 times. That was strange, because after 3 it was supposed to go to voicemail, but it still picked up on the other end. "This is Bill?" It was asked like a question, as if Bill had no idea who he was. "Yeah, Bill, it's Dean. The store was out of small doc, so I couldn't get rid of my cold. I'll have to come in tomorrow." He remembered it was Friday today. "I'll have to come in Monday." "That's unfortunate. Dean, we'd love to have you back." Dean pulled the phone away from his ear. Okay then, Bill, I'll see you Monday. Monday. Dean hung up. Even on a Friday, Bill had never sounded like that. He didn't know what that was all about, but suddenly he didn't feel so bad about taking the day off. Still and all, he was still coughing, and his sinuses were killing him. He needed to do something about that quickly. That meant a quick trip to the pharmacy. Again, things were strange when he arrived. It was early, yes, but there were still usually a couple of cars, usually with the elderly customers who needed their medication as soon as possible. But the only cars that appeared to be in the lot were the employees parked around back. The road, too, was surprisingly quiet. There were cars, but again, on a Friday, a work day. It wasn't exactly Denver, but he didn't live out in the sticks either. There was supposed to be some kind of traffic this time of day, but it was like people had been invited to a party and didn't tell him about it. Still cautious, he went to the front door of the pharmacy and went in. Everything was about as normal as one would expect from your typical drugstore. Somebody was working in the back, kneeling by a shelf and stocking it, who would likely have to come up to the register since, for some odd reason, every pharmacy these days only had one employee who handled everything, and rows upon rows of sundries mixed in with snacks that were the antithesis of good health. Dean went over to the row of cough and cold medicines and frowned. The selection was dwindling. The section was probably about a third of what it was the last time he bought some, and that was small even at the time. Traditional cough medicines were on the way out. Why get them after all? Obsolete. Not needed anymore. He grabbed the store brand, heavily discounted. He waved to the stocker in the back. "Hello? Can I get some serv—" The stocker stopped what he was doing and stood up. Well, stood up was one way of putting it, as they didn't get up on one knee like one would expect, but pulled up like a marionette, both legs unfurling beneath them until they stood as straight as possible. The stocker then turned, and Dean got a good look at their face. A rictus smile, the eyes wide open and the white crawling with small grayish shapes. In fact, only the green iris was visible beneath the swirling mass. "Hello, customer. Can I help you?" That same weird, drawn-out sound like Bill at work. I'd like to buy some cold and flu medicine, please. Can you ring me up?" The stocker's head clicked, the neck tilting at a strange angle as if trying to recall something, then moved forward in that same marionette style, the knees lifting before the rest of the leg, stumbling toward the counter under the control of some other force. Dean slowly walked up to the register, keeping away distance from the employee, but not really sure if they were a threat or what. The man with the gray eyes leaned over the cash register, finger lifting in the air, hovering over the buttons, and began pressing them one at a time, as if seeing them for the first time. It was an achingly long process, but whatever was going on seemed to be working. Without looking up, his other hand shot out, expecting the piece of merchandise. Dean handed it over, and the man looked at the UPC on it. Instead of the scanner on the counter, the man stuck his wobbly digit against the USB plug on the side of the register, opened his mouth, and a red beam came out, pointing at the medicine box. There was a beep. The screen rang up the item, as expected. The employee tapped out the register, now seeming to get the hang of it again, then slapped a hand down on the card reader. Then tapped it several times, obviously trying to get Dean to pay for his item. Dean pulled out his card and stuck the chip in, keeping himself at arm's length. When it finally rung up, he pulled the card away. He waited as the employee took the bottle of medicine, stuck it inside a gigantic plastic bag, then handed it to him. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" No, I'm fine, thank you." "May I recommend you buy a box of small duck? We all have." "I can see that. Well, have a good day. if you still can. Maybe. The clerk raised a hand and swung it around jerkily in a parody of a wave. Dean kept his eye on the strange fellow until he was finally able to back his way out of the store. He drove back to his apartment. As he drove, he saw the occasional person wobbling and dragging themselves around, just like the one at the pharmacy. It was like everyone in town was affected by it. He flicked on the radio, and he finally found a news station, or rather, it was the morning drive team, but giving news as only the morning drive team could. "So, Hector, what's going on in Newburgh? Anything new?" "Just saying the city is quarantined at the moment. Again, folks, if you are in the Newburgh area and have a small dark nanite pack with a serial number beginning with 2045, please do not use it, and immediately give it to your local pharmacy for proper disposal, or send it back to the company for a full refund. This batch appears to have been wrongfully labeled and was a test batch intended for cosmetic surgical application only. Repeat, do not attempt to use." Dean drove past a park. He saw a mother pushing her little girl on a swing. Both of them had that same wide smile, their movements spastic and unstable. When he got back to his apartment, he went down into his apartment, locked the door as tightly as he could, and went over to the drawer where his little tube of Smoldock lay. He pulled it out and checked the serial number. 2045. Then another series of letters and numbers. He felt the laughter start at his hips, and finally start to move all the way through to the top of his head. He tossed it back in the drawer, slammed it shut, and couldn't stop laughing as he made his way back over to his chair, turned on the TV, and slugged his cold medicine right out of the bottle. A week passed. Dean remained glued to his TV. His supplies of food were dwindling, and he would have to go out there at some point to get more. But from what he saw on the news, he didn't want to. He thought by now the townsfolk would have regressed into some sort of strange, zombie-like creatures, growling and attacking each other in the streets. He imagined himself with a bandolier of homemade weaponry and a red Rambo bandana around his head, charging headlong through the enemy, pinning them to the way with his homemade sharpened flagpole, a symbol of survival and patriotism, the likes of which none had seen since Mel Gibson did it in, well, The Patriot. But here he was, unshaven, sleep-deprived, his clothes and body not having washed in days, as the news gave him a bleaker picture. Nobody had come into town. Due to the nature of the nanites, everyone just assumed that they could now pass like a virus, even through protective clothing, and so it was judged too risky to engage in a rescue. Then again, they didn't expect any real survivors, as everyone took Smoldock. Everyone in town had purchased it, according to pulled credit and debit records, including Dean, even though his supply remained untouched in his drawer. But there was overhead camera views from helicopters, far-off scenes of news crews behind barricades. The stumbling, bumbling fools like the ones he saw that first day were gone. The cosmetic, surgical nature of the nanites was becoming all the more apparent. The people began to alter. Flesh began to peel away, revealing new, shiny armor plating underneath. Eyes popped from their sockets and were left to rot in the street as new, flashy orbs replaced them, capable, it was assumed from testing, of seeing very far into the various spectrums. The creatures were attracted to both infrared and ultraviolet beams. They began speaking, standing more comfortably on their own 2 feet, or 3 or 4, depending on whatever need the creatures had. It seemed now that, yes, the nanites were in control of the people, converting them into some kind of robotic menagerie of creatures of all kinds, mostly humanoid. But some were, well, other. Some utterly alien in appearance, and doing so at a rapid pace. The news crew thought the nanites were working overtime, aware of their shortened lifespan, and knew they had to finish their work before their programmed end time. Perhaps they were trying to extend their lives. Nobody knew. The new cyborgian things could be heard speaking, though they didn't need to. They all seemed to be connected by a Wi-Fi signal and could speak almost telepathically. The language appeared to be for the benefit of the humans on the other side of the barricade, listening. But Dean had heard them speaking. Some of them came to his door. Some called him on the phone. Bill had called him several times. "Dean, it's Bill, your boss. I haven't seen you in a while. You feeling better?" That slow, growly drawl was gone entirely. He now spoke in the voice Dean recognized from many, many visits to his office, but with a strange metallic twinge. "Nah, probably can't come in just yet. Everyone would be mad at my cough." "I think that's just an excuse, Dean. I think you need to understand that we aren't going to give you a hard time anymore. We're not bothered by coughs and things, you see. We'd love it if you'd take some medicine and feel better, certainly, but we miss you and want you back. Your desk is waiting for you. Heck, we even have a welcome back package here. I think it would make you feel even more welcome." He hung up then. He couldn't keep the conversation going. He would occasionally hear a thump on his door, his mother coming to visit. Mom had 4 arms now. She probably could have broken down the door, but she didn't talk to him that way. She didn't act threateningly. She spoke soothingly through the door about how her aches and pains were gone, that she was feeling better. Miraculous, really, that small doc. How did humanity ever live without it? Then again, maybe that was the problem, she kept saying. "They're fixing so much, Dean," she would say. "So much." She didn't know what she was capable of until they dug into her brain and started making promises nobody had ever been able to keep before. Dean just got up, grabbed the blanket from his bed, and buried himself in the couch with it stretched over him, not daring to answer, to say a word. It couldn't be his mother out there, could it? She never tried to force him, but did try to tempt him, coax him, get him to choose on his own, to make it so he would come to her with open arms. If they were monsters out there, wouldn't they have broken down his door and taken him away, injected him by now? The news was going back into repeats, speculating on whether it might be best to just bomb Newburgh back to the Stone Age, while plenty of protesters argued about how awful an idea that really was, that nobody really knew the situation on the ground. Dean went back over to the drawer and pulled out the tube again, rolling it over in his fingers. He looked down at the label again, and it dawned on him. Do not use on an unwilling recipient. He put his hands down at his sides. He looked at his chair in front of the TV and at his apartment door. It was so easy to be independent, to be the rebel, when you had something you understood. But this was different. He wasn't different anymore. He was alone. Being alone wasn't the same as standing alone. He held it up once more, ready to drop it back in the drawer. This time he didn't, and he remembered friends. It's okay not to worry about every little thing in the world. What could be littler than this? I hope you enjoyed Side Effects May Include by Hyde Price, as performed by your friendly neighbor, Malcolm Blackwood. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author.
I have to hand it to them. Nanites can be very clever, but certainly I wouldn't put anything in my own body I can't control.
No, of course not. Somebody else would have to put it there for you, certainly.
Is there something you'd like to tell me, Malcolm?
Do you have another story up your sleeve?
Well, since we're clearly changing the subject, yes, I do. We here have another story from Craig Groshek. This one a frightful little spectacle of hearing loss, hearing found, and too much information for anyone to handle. Without further ado, I present to you Invasive Thoughts. Part 1. Henry Ashford sat alone in his small, dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at the television, though he hadn't registered anything on the screen in hours. The dull, relentless whine in his ears drowned out any hope of following the plot of whatever movie he'd put on. He shifted uncomfortably in his worn recliner, one hand pressed to his temple. His head pulsed with exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot from another restless night. It was hard to remember what silence felt like. Once a typical working man with an unremarkable job and a few hobbies, Henry's life had slowly unraveled ever since tinnitus had begun to claim his mind and sense of peace. He tried everything. Doctor prescribed pills, meditation, noise-canceling headphones, even a white noise machine, but nothing worked. The high-pitched ringing remained, punctuating every quiet moment. Over the past year, his friends started avoiding him. They'd grown tired of his increasingly bitter mood, his constant complaints about the ringing. Even his family had stopped calling as often. On the few occasions he went out, he found himself caught in half-conversations, nodding when he couldn't hear, his thoughts too muddled to feign engagement. Socializing had become too much of a strain, and now he stayed home most nights, tired of explaining his situation to people who couldn't understand. Just as his frustration reached a boiling point, the screen flickered, pulling him out of his thoughts. A new commercial had begun. Its jingle, upbeat and saccharine, completely at odds with his apartment's dimly lit, melancholy atmosphere. The screen lit up in neon colors, proclaiming a name that sounded like salvation. Ear Ease Drops. He squinted at the small text running along the bottom of the screen. Guaranteed relief from tinnitus. Try it today. Henry leaned forward enraptured. He watched the actors on the screen, smiling as they applied the product, their faces lighting up as if experiencing peace for the first time. They sat in their respective rooms, their expressions serene, seemingly filled with a tranquility he hadn't known in years. The voiceover promised miracles, using phrases like absolute relief and permanent solution. Nervous with exhilaration, Henry fumbled for his phone to jot down the number on the screen before it disappeared. "This could," he stammered, already imagining the silence he'd craved for so long. "This could be it." The thought filled him with an urgent, unfamiliar hope. The drops arrived 2 days later in a small, nondescript box. He tore it open enthusiastically, barely noticing the plain label that bore no indication of what was inside. He unscrewed the cap of the tiny bottle with shaking hands, pausing only briefly to glance over the instructions. They were simple enough. Apply 2 drops in each ear, wait 5 minutes, and repeat if necessary. The promise of instant relief outweighed any hesitation. Henry settled onto his bed, tilted his head, and squeezed the bottle, feeling the cool liquid settle in his ear canal. He followed suit with the other ear, laying flat as instructed, listening to the slight squelching sound of the drops finding their way into his inner ear. A faint tingling began to spread, and he closed his eyes, holding his breath in anticipation. Within moments, a strange stillness crept over him. The sound that had plagued him for as long as he could remember slowly faded to a faint hum, and then to nothing at all. Henry opened his eyes, sitting up slowly. For the first time in half a decade, there was no buzzing, no shrill whine. He listened to the natural, uninterrupted ambiance of his own apartment, savoring the lack of noise. His entire body felt lighter, unburdened, free. A grin spread across his face, tentative at first and then wide with disbelief. "It worked," he whispered, barely daring to believe it. It actually worked. That night, he slept better than he had in years. When he awoke, he was refreshed, his mind clear, and for the first time in ages, he felt like himself again. As he went about his day, he found joy in the smallest sounds, the soft rustling of paper, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, even the distant rumble of traffic outside. Each sound felt vivid, unfiltered by the persistent ringing that had previously dulled his senses. He went out for coffee, sitting by himself near the cafe counter, enjoying the gentle background noise of conversation and clinking dishes. But as he waited for his coffee, something strange happened. A faint whisper drifted into his mind, so soft he thought it was someone nearby. He turned his head, but the shop was nearly empty except for the barista, who was busy steaming milk. The whisper grew louder, forming words that didn't match anything he could see. He could hear the barista's voice, clearer than he should have. He wasn't speaking, and yet the words seemed to come directly from him. I can't wait for this shift to end. I hate this job so much. God, that guy at the counter just keeps staring. Were they talking about him? Henry stiffened, turning his gaze down to his cup. He tried to brush it off as his imagination, but as he sipped, another thought crept into his mind. A feminine voice, crisp and critical, yet there was no woman near him. Still, it echoed, the tone unmistakable. He looks like he hasn't slept in years. What's he hiding? Henry's stomach twisted and his face turned red with embarrassment. The comments had been directed at him. He knew it. He hastily finished his drink, feeling more than a little unnerved, and left the cafe. On his way out, he passed a man on his phone and instantly heard him, too. Not just his voice, but the thoughts behind the voice. The ones he wasn't saying out loud. If I don't get this deal, my wife's gonna leave me. The man looked directly at Henry, almost as if he'd heard him eavesdropping. Henry forced a smile and hurried on, trying to clear his mind. But no matter how he tried, the thoughts came in like waves from everyone he passed, random and intrusive. Rather than fade over time, they seemed to be getting louder and more frequent. Henry's seemingly miraculous reprieve had been short-lived, and what had filled the space formerly occupied by his relentless tinnitus, he was afraid to admit, was worse. So much worse. A chill settled over him by the time he reached home. For the first time since he applied the drops, Henry felt a stab of fear. Was this permanent? Part 2. Henry hurried back to his apartment, his mind still reeling from the unexpected invasion of thoughts he'd experienced at the cafe. He shut the door behind him, leaning his back against it, and took a deep breath. In the silence of his apartment, he felt relieved, hopeful that whatever had just happened at the coffee shop was a fluke. Perhaps it was a temporary side effect of the drops, or simply his mind adjusting to his new reality and playing tricks on him. He walked into his kitchen and splashed cold water on his face. As he dried his face on a towel, he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. Product is new, he rationalized. These things happen sometime. But beneath it all, he knew instinctively that something was deeply, deeply wrong. Even as he tried to suppress his lingering doubts, he heard the whispers creeping in again, softly at first, like the distant din of a television left on in another room. Though he tried desperately to focus on something else, anything else, the voices grew louder, words forming in his mind as clearly as if they were his own. When is he going to fix that leaky faucet? It's driving me crazy, came a woman's voice laden with irritation. Henry recognized it immediately. that of his neighbor from the apartment next door, and she wasn't speaking aloud. As if carried on the wind, her unspoken, private thoughts floated into his mind. Henry's pulse quickened. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the kitchen mat, panic bubbling up in his chest. He wasn't imagining it. The drops had worked to stop his tinnitus, but they'd done something else, too. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white, trying to steady himself. "Calm down," he whispered to himself. He took another breath, desperate to regain control. But control was a fleeting notion. As he tried to center himself, more thoughts flooded in, overlapping and crowding his mind. From somewhere in the hall, he heard a man's anxiety about a job interview, replaying the answers he'd practiced for hours. Then, a burst of anger from others, distant frustration at a slow elevator, a taxi that hadn't stopped, a spill on the carpet. Henry fought back the urge to scream as the thoughts blended, swirling together in an endless cacophony, threatening to derail his sanity. The voices were coming from people he couldn't see or identify, and yet they felt as close as if they were in the room with him. He clapped his hands over his ears, the futility of the solution obvious to him even as he did it. The voices weren't coming from outside, seeping into his consciousness from everyone around him. It was useless. "I have to get out of here," he muttered, his voice barely audible amidst the crowd of thoughts filling his head. Once more, he staggered to the bathroom, turning on the faucet and splashing water over his face, hoping the cold shock would silence the invasion. But it was no use. The voices persisted, relentless, trickling in like water through cracks in a crumbling dam. Henry peered into the bathroom mirror and realized with horror that he barely recognized the pale reflection staring back at him with bloodshot eyes. His hand shook as he reached for the bottle of ear ease drops he'd left on the sink from the night before. The label offered no warnings, no hint of the nightmare he was now living, just simple instructions to apply as needed for complete tinnitus relief. He recoiled at its absurdity, the promise of permanent relief that had not only been temporary, but followed by this unbearable infringement. He clutched the bottle, wondering if more drops would silence the thoughts or make them worse. Indecisively, Henry paced the apartment for several minutes before ultimately sinking into his armchair. Gripping the armrests and pressing his palms into the fabric, he tried desperately to steady his breathing and ground himself, even as the never-ending barrage of interloping thoughts threatened to drown out his very intentions. Focus, he told himself, but the word felt thin and meaningless. The whispers continued, filling the air around him, a cloud of unfiltered lunacy bleeding into itself. He tried to concentrate on a single voice, hoping that doing so might bring him some control. He picked out a faint whisper from his next-door neighbor, her thoughts turning to a grocery list. Eggs, milk, bread, her voice echoed in his mind. Cheese, apple juice, lasagna. But as soon as he managed to focus on her, another voice intruded, and then another, until before long it was once again buried under an avalanche of madness. Already fatigued, Henry found the weight of the combined worries of countless strangers way too much to bear. He cried out in agony as yet another wave of exhaustion washed over him, straining his tenuous grip on reality. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He had to find a way to shut it off, to make the voices go away. He pulled out his phone, searching online for any mention of ear eavesdrops side effects. But the internet was filled only with rave reviews and testimonials from people who had finally found relief. There was not a single mention of voices or hearing other people's thoughts. Frustrated, he flung the phone down, trembling head to toe, overwhelmed by anxiety. This was more than a side effect, Henry opined. It was a curse. He glanced again at the bottle of drops, sitting innocently on the bathroom counter. The medication seemed to beckon to him, challenging him to try another dose. What if it can somehow bring him control? Could more drops reverse the effects? He had to know. And yet, for some reason, the idea filled him with dread. How could the same medicine that made him sick make him healthy? It was preposterous. No, he thought. There had to be another way. Henry's eyes drifted to his front door, where he could still faintly hear his neighbor's thoughts, a dull murmur bleeding through the walls. He'd heard enough. Maybe he could try leaving, escaping into less populated areas. Perhaps, he thought, distancing himself from people would offer him some respite from the chaos. It's worth a try, he figured. Even as he rose to his feet, another disembodied voice drifted into Henry's mind. Sharp, accusatory, and somehow familiar. He's losing it. What's wrong with him? This time, the commentary seemed personal, directed squarely at him. Henry turned sharply, looking around as if he could catch whoever had thought it, but as usual, there was no one. Getting out of town will help, Henry imagined. It has to. With a heavy breath, he grabbed his car keys, put on his coat, and headed out into the hall, hoping against hope that he was right. Part 3. Henry stepped outside into the cold, praying the crisp air would clear his head. It didn't. The voices followed him, as persistent as his own shadow. He realized then that driving perhaps wasn't the best idea or safe. He was exhausted and in no condition to operate a vehicle. Instead, he did what he could. He pulled his coat tighter and walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, seeking any sort of relief. All the while, the myriad concerns of everyone in his vicinity echoed in his mind like the din of overlapping radio stations he couldn't turn off. He passed a young couple holding hands, and a sudden burst of insecurity hit him. Does she even really love me? Or is she just settling? The thought came unbidden, embedded like a thorn. Then the woman's thoughts. I should tell him, but what if he leaves me? Their thoughts intertwined with his own, their fears mingling with his mounting paranoia, and he hurried away, heart pounding, clawing at his temples. But as he rounded the corner, more voices hit him, an insistent, overpowering storm of words. Out of it, a passing man's voice rose, remarkably bitter and laced with vitriol. One day, I'm going to snap. Just wait. Henry reeled as if he'd been punched in the gut and nearly stumbled into the street. He knew it wasn't his thought, yet he could feel it undulating in his mind, dark and suffocating. The world around him was filled with people with questions and concerns, and for whatever reason, most of those coming to him were depressed, angst-ridden, obsessed, or downright homicidal. And though he knew they were independent of him, he couldn't help but allow the thoughts to affect him, and the longer they did, the harder it became to separate them from his own. He ducked into a nearby grocery store, clinging to the hope that the familiarity of routine could stabilize him, and snatched a nearby shopping cart. But inside, the onslaught only worsened. Every person he passed seemed to radiate their inner turmoil and buried regrets, all vying for his attention. The elderly woman, picking up a carton of milk, was caught up in a wave of grief, reliving a memory of a lost child. The cashier's thoughts were muddled with fatigue, replaying a day she'd rather forget. The out-of-work single mother, clinging to the leash of her support dog, was on the verge of tears, imagining all the ways in which she had failed in life, wondering if her credit card would go through. Each of their thoughts felt strangely personal, and one by one, they carved out space in Henry's mind, blending with his memories and fears. As wave after wave of invasive thoughts mercilessly inundated his consciousness, Henry realized he could scarcely tell where their thoughts ended and his began. Henry felt as though he was unraveling. He gripped the edge of his cart, struggling to steady himself, his voice lost amongst the relentless torrents of others' emotions, doubts, and fears. Defeated, he turned and fled the store as if pursued by some unseen predator and left his empty cart behind. Nothing was working. The voices weren't fading. Every corner he turned and every person he encountered only added to the noise. Horrified, Henry realized he couldn't even remember what silence sounded like. For a moment, he even begged for his tinnitus to return. Anything but this. He sprinted back to his apartment, slamming the door shut behind him, as if closing it would somehow block out the flood of thoughts. He pressed his back against the door, closing his eyes, willing himself to find a solution. But his mind felt fractured. His own thoughts were scattered, outnumbered by the chorus of others, flitting in and out of his mind at breakneck speed. After a few moments, he forced himself to breathe deeply, grasping for any sense of normalcy. He returned to the bathroom, grasping the sink. In the back of his mind, a faint whisper resurfaced, and he recognized it as his next-door neighbor's frustration with her broken faucet. A voice he could not block out no matter how much he tried. "Focus, Henry," he mused aloud. "You're still you, just focus." With shaking hands, he fumbled for a pair of earplugs, pressing them into his ears and hoping the soft foam would somehow resolve the issue. But the thoughts persisted, flowing directly into his mind, oblivious to any barrier. Unsure of what else to do, he sat down in the center of his living room, clamped his hands over his ears, and squeezed his eyes shut, fighting back the rising tide of panic. He tried concentrating on a single coherent thought, his thought. But each time he did, another pierced the barriers between them, shattering his illusions of control. Desperate, he grabbed his phone and dialed his doctor's office, his fingers trembling as he held the phone to his ear, listening to the ringing. Finally, after several agonizing minutes on hold, the receptionist picked up, her voice a welcome relief, something real and tangible amidst the deluge of negativity he'd been dealing with. But as he spoke, he could hear her thoughts too, a quiet murmur beneath her words. Another anxious patient. Another long day. Her unspoken judgment sliced through him, sharp and stinging, and he felt himself spiraling into a dark wall of paranoia, as though everyone around him knew something he didn't. "Hello, Henry? Are you still there?" she asked, concerned, though her thoughts remained indifferent, her mind already moving to the next patient. Henry hadn't even realized he'd failed to respond. Yes, I need to see Dr. Wells," he stammered. "Please, you have to help me." The appointment was set for later that day, and Henry spent the following hours in a haze, pacing his apartment, trying anything and everything to manage the voices. He tried blasting music, wearing noise-canceling headphones, even wrapping a pillow around his head, but none of it made any difference. When he finally arrived at the doctor's office, he took a seat in the waiting room, struggling to keep his composure. The thoughts here, perhaps predictably, were worse than any he had heard before. Disjointed, multitudinous snippets of worry about diagnoses, regret over missed opportunities, anger at loved ones, fears of death and dying, infirmity, and financial devastation. It was a stew of raw, unfiltered emotion he wasn't prepared for. By the time Dr. Wells called him in, Henry felt like he was barely holding on. The doctor greeted his alarming appearance and clammy, sweaty hands with a polite smile and a firm handshake. But inside, Henry could hear the doctor's private assessment of him, thoughts tainted with impatience and frustration. "So what seems to be the problem?" Dr. Wells asked, his voice professional, though his mind continued to whisper judgment that only Henry could hear. Henry tried to explain, stumbling over his words, desperate to convey the nightmare he was living, but the words felt hollow, as though they weren't his own, fragmented by the thoughts filling his head. Were they even his thoughts anymore? Henry questioned. How did he really feel? Why was he here? Why bother? How was this doctor, already dialing it in, going to help him? Henry did his best to explain what had brought him to the office, beginning with the tinnitus and venturing into a painful, wincing recollection of his experience with Jiry's. But even as Henry spoke, Dr. Wells' mind filled with silent conclusions. Possible anxiety disorder, perhaps psychosis. Slicing through Henry's last semblance of hope, Dr. Wells didn't believe him. He thought he was crazy. Maybe he was, but it wasn't his fault. Or was it? Maybe everything was his fault. Inadvertently, Henry shuddered. Dr. Wells gave him a pitiful look, having already decided that a handful of pills was the solution. Dr. Wells finally prescribed some anxiety medication, advising Henry to take it easy and get plenty of rest. As Henry departed the clinic, he felt more powerless than ever. He stared blankly at the written summary of his office visit, his eyes glazing over at the sight of his alleged diagnosis, at the name, address, and phone number of the pharmacy down the street. Dejected, he crumpled the papers, tossed them into a nearby garbage can, and headed home. Part 4. Henry sat alone in his apartment, the weight of desperation and now depression crushing him. The voices in his head churned as they were filled with regret, ridicule, and hatred as ever. Every attempt to block them out had failed. His doctor had written him off, hadn't even investigated his claims. But suppose he could call his friends, the few of them he had left. But what would he tell them, and what would they say, let alone do? They'd grown tired of his depressing condition months ago, and those bridges, he imagined, had been thoroughly burned. His family wouldn't be much help either, each of them dealing with their own demons. Henry had a mind to find every one of the people whose thoughts were flooding his mind, complaining about their lots in life, their insignificant problems. Who cared if their relationships didn't work out and their proposals were rejected? So what if they didn't get that raise they wanted, or their fathers didn't love them? And if they wanted to kill someone, they ought to just shut up and do it already, so long as it meant he didn't have to hear them whine and cry about it anymore. In fact, Henry thought, his patience and empathy eroded under the pressure of everyone else's anxieties. Everyone would be better off if they killed whoever was causing their problems, or better yet, themselves. He sneered. Yes, he thought, a disturbing sequence of fantasies unfolding vividly in his mind's eye. If everyone was dead, then it would finally be quiet. Fortunately, Henry had no real interest in hastening the demise of the innocent men and women whose worries had destroyed his life. They were victims too, caught up in the maelstrom created by his desperate attempts to escape his problems. He was no different than they were, not really, and he was certain that if they could hear his thoughts, they would be equally as disgusted. In the end, Henry thought, they were all in this together. No one causing him this trouble was truly to blame, and none of them were hurting him on purpose, or even aware of it. Except, Henry realized, someone was. Lost as he was in the haze of others' thoughts, Henry wasn't surprised he hadn't thought of it sooner. Jiry's, they had to know. Someone had to know. Someone sitting in a lab or an office. Someone collecting a paycheck in exchange for destroying lives. Someone was responsible for what had happened to him, Henry realized, and they were real and accessible. Then and there, a plan took shape in his mind, a reckless plan, wrought in the mind of a desperate man pushed too far for too long. He would travel to the Jiry's headquarters and confront those responsible. They must have known what the drops would do. This couldn't be accidental. Someone had to have answers, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get them. Even as Henry grabbed the knife from his kitchen drawer and slid it into his coat pocket, and deposited the bottle of Jiry's drops into his pants, the gravity of what he was about to do became clear. The weight of the blade in his hand did nothing but steel his resolve. Without hesitation, he left his apartment and got in his car, driving toward the company headquarters. It was over 12 hours away, and every nerve in his body was on edge, but he didn't care. This had to end, and he would do anything to ensure it did. Henry gently patted the hilt of the blade concealed in the jacket lying on his passenger seat. Anything. The hours on the road passed in a blur of mental torment. Every car around him brought a fresh wave of thoughts, each passing driver filling his mind with a cascade of their personal insecurities, frustrations, and silent monologues. He could hear it all, every intimate detail of the strangers surrounding him, driving all semblance of rational thought further into oblivion with each passing mile. By the time he reached the city, Henry was writhing in agony, pleading for an end to the anguish. The voices, having previously haunted him innocently, had now become a shrieking, inexorable chorus, demanding answers. Unable to escape the din, he'd been reduced to little more than a barely contained bundle of nerves and anger, even more determined to end his suffering by any means necessary. The crowds, the traffic, the enormity of it all. It was too much. Even as he raced toward what he believed was the solution, the only solution, he teetered on the brink of madness. Finally, he reached the sleek, towering headquarters of Jiry's parent company. Twitching and fidgeting, disheveled from the drive, he pushed through the glass doors and headed straight for the first-floor elevators. As singularly focused as he was on his goal, Henry hadn't concerned himself at all about his looks. A security guard, however, spotted him almost immediately, his gaze narrowing as he took in Henry's appearance. Sir?" the guard asked, stepping forward. "Is everything all right?" Henry's paranoia sparked, his heart thundering in his chest as he impotently took in the guard's eternal monologue. "Guy's got blood on him, looks unstable, could be dangerous." The guard's eyes drifted to Henry's coat, where what appeared to be the hilt of a blade was visible, protruding slightly from the pocket. Henry could feel the guard's suspicion growing, and his hand inched closer to his weapon. "I just need to see someone," Henry muttered, but his words sounded foreign, drowned out by the noise in his mind. Slowly, steadily, Henry reached into his pocket, tightening his hand around the knife's handle, the guard's thoughts escalating in response, an emotional mixture of determination, doubts, and false bravado. "Oh, God, no. I hope he doesn't try anything. I'm ready, and I'll take him down if I have to. Oh, God, please don't do it." Henry's panic won out. Before he knew what he was doing, he rapidly withdrew the knife and lunged, plunging the blade into the guard's side. Blood splattered across his coat and face as he repeatedly withdrew the knife and jabbed it back into the young man's midsection, sending streams of crimson gore flying in all directions. The guard, unprepared for the ferocity of Henry's assault, succumbed to his injuries. His weapon fell to the floor with a clatter as he slumped over and collapsed to the marble floor. A moment later, his dying thoughts filled Henry's mind with broken fragments. "Addison, help me. I love you. It burns. Oh, God, it hurts. What did I do? Caleb's birthday next month. He's 10. What's happening? What did I do?" As the guard took his final breath and his eyes went dull and glassy, Henry staggered back, his breath labored, the knife dripping with blood. What he'd done hadn't completely sunk in yet, but it would. The guard lay still, and a calm settled over the lobby. But even in the stillness of the aftermath, the voices continued. The shock of Henry's actions faded, replaced by the relentless pressure of his need for answers. Even in his adrenaline-fueled days, Henry knew he didn't have much time. Soaked in blood, Henry took the elevator to the top floor, his face grim with determination. As he emerged, employees turned to stare, their expression shifting to horror as they took in the gore splattered on his coat and the crimson-coated knife in his hands. Undeterred, Henry walked past the stunned onlookers, who backed away instinctively, whispering, their thoughts flooding his mind in a wave of fear and disbelief. He pushed forward, ignoring them, his focus narrowing to the office at the end of the hall. Inside, Henry's chosen scapegoat, CEO Marcus Evinrude, sat completely unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. Henry approached the office, his footsteps heavy, leaving a trail of bloody smears on the carpet. The CEO's assistant sat at her desk, her eyes going wide as she took notice of the amount of blood on Henry and of the knife in his hand, registering what he had done. Her mind filled with frantic thoughts. "Oh my God, what's happening? I need to call the police." Before she even reached for the phone, her internal panic rose to a scream in Henry's mind. The sound was unbearable, an incessant wail of terror that clawed at the edges of his all but depleted self-control. Impulsively, he sprang in her direction, silencing her both inside and out with one swift motion, drawing his blade swiftly across her throat, and watched her flail helplessly before collapsing over her desk, clutching her wounds. This time, he'd killed her so efficiently that she wouldn't even have time to think of her loved ones. Beneath the cold exterior of Henry's blood-soaked countenance, a now foreign-feeling emotion welled up inside of him. Sadness. Shaking his head, Henry banished the thought and focused again on his mission. Henry returned his gaze to Evinrude's office door. Fortuitously, he found it unlocked and pushed it open, stepping inside. Blood stained the polished floor beneath his feet as he strode toward the object of his ire. The CEO looked up from his desk, his face blanching, as he took in the sight of Henry. Absorbed by a phone call and shielded from the sounds of the horror outside by soundproof doors, Evinrude had been totally oblivious to his assailant's approach and to the danger he was now in. It didn't take long for Evinrude to realize his predicament. His fear was palpable, his thoughts a rapid-fire mess of confusion and terror. "Who? What? Is this man?" he thought. "What's going on?" "Why'd you do this to me?" Henry screamed, interrupting Evinrude's reverie. His voice broke as he clutched the knife harder and stepped forward, repeating his demand for answers. "Why did you make those drops, knowing what they would do? Why, Evinrude? Why?" I don't," Evinrude stammered. I don't know what you—" "Stop it! No!" Henry shouted. "You had to know. Stop lying!" Henry shook with rage, waving the knife at Evinrude. "Why did you do it? Why? The CEO's terror grew, his thoughts echoing in Henry's mind, each one a jagged edge of fear. He's covered in blood. Oh my God, I'm going to die. He's going to kill me. Oh, please, Lord, what's happening? I don't understand what he's talking about. Stop lying, Henry screeched, furiously, punctuating each word dramatically. Now, within striking range, he took a hold of Evinrude with his free hand, clutched him by his collar, and slammed him against the desk. The voices won't stop. They never stop. As if on autopilot, Henry raised his fist and struck the CEO hard, his anger and desperation boiling over, and he then did it again, over and over again. He drove his knuckles into Evinrude's increasingly mangled visage. You can end this. Just tell me the truth, you monster. Tell me. The CEO gasped, blood trickling from his mouth as he choked out. I don't know what you're talking about. Who are you? Why are you doing this? He glanced at the bloody knife in Henry's opposite hand, his fear giving way to shock and confusion. With his free hand, Henry reached into his pants and retrieved the bottle of ear ease drops, his hand shaking as he shoved it into the CEO's blood-covered, rapidly swelling face. Look at this. Why did you make this? Tell me how to make it stop. There must be an antidote, some way to reverse it. The CEO's eyes locked on the bottle, a flicker of bewilderment crossing his face. Through shallow, gurgling breaths, he rasped, That's not ours. That's not what our packaging looks like. That's our name, but that's not mine. Semi-conscious and reeling from Henry's blows, Evinrude's gaze drifted lazily toward a display shelf across from his desk, and he pointed in its direction. There, rows of sleek, professionally packaged ear ease products stood in neat rows. Henry's grip faltered, his mind reeling as he processed the words. At first, he dismissed Evinrude's denials as an attempt to escape punishment or to avoid answering for his crimes. But then he glanced at the shells Evinrude was pointing to and knew instantly that they looked nothing like the plain clinical bottle he held. He stared at the drops in his hand, and suddenly a wave of terror washed over him, rivaling any he'd felt to date. Realization dawned, cold and cruel, tightening around his mind like a vice. This man, this company, they had nothing to do with the product he'd been sent. He'd been tricked, led down a path of violence and destruction by someone else entirely. Shaken, he stumbled backward, peering at his blood-caked hands in horror. Before he could comprehend the full extent of what he'd done, police and security guards burst into the room. Commands echoed around him, but Henry could barely hear them over the cacophony of thoughts flooding his mind. Disbelief, terror, judgment, condemnation. There may have been other voices mingling in with the real ones, thoughts emanating from the many strangers rushing into the office. But for once, Henry wasn't focused on them. All he could do was stare at the bottle in one hand, the knife in the other. As he stood there, paralyzed, a single tear welled up and rolled down his cheek, mingling with the blood of his victims. "Put down the knife," one officer shouted, his voice breaking through the clamor. But Henry couldn't separate it from the storm in his mind. He remained frozen for a moment longer, before both his hands began trembling uncontrollably. As the anxiety overwhelmed him, he turned to face the crowd, absent-mindedly brandishing the knife, and opened his mouth to apologize. Before he could utter a word, a single shot rang out, and then, at last, Henry experienced silence. Epilogue. In a dimly lit basement, a man in a lab coat, face obscured by safety goggles, meticulously filled small glass bottles with a thick, clear liquid, carefully applying plain labels that read ear eavesdrops. He sealed one in a package, printed a shipping label with the recipient's name, and added it to a stack of similar boxes. Around him, artifacts lay scattered across a workbench. Candles, strange symbols, and darkly inked manuscripts. Nearby, his computer monitor glowed softly, displaying a list of intercepted orders from the producers of Ear Ease. Henry Ashford's name was highlighted, recently marked in green, with a note that read, "Complete." With a satisfied smile, the man typed in the next name, his eyes glinting as he prepared his next shipment. Henry's suffering had served its purpose, but his work was far from over. I hope you enjoyed Invasive Thoughts by Craig Groshek, as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Craig-Groshek. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/CRAIG-GROSHEK. Craig Groshek is the creator and operator of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, which has grown to nearly 500,000 subscribers, over 3,000 uploads, and more than 69 million video views in its 12 years of operation. He also oversees the production of 4 weekly audio horror fiction podcasts, faithfully adapting and featuring the work of thousands of indie horror authors. A published author himself, dozens of his short stories have been adapted to audio for the channel and other platforms. He holds a bachelor's degree in communications from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and in his free time, Groshek enjoys a wide range of outdoor activities, traveling, and spending time with his 3 horror-loving children and close friends. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author, as well as all of the authors who provided us with stories tonight. And thank you to Malcolm Blackwood, my good neighbor, for his evening's tale.
And thank you. Looks as though that last story cleared me right up. My allergies are gone, and I'm ready to face the day. A shame it's already pushing midnight, though.
Now, before we go, we'd also like to take a moment to thank you personally for joining us on this episode of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. If you enjoyed what you've heard on today's program, please take a moment to stop by our iTunes page or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts and leave us a 5-star review and a kind word. It makes a huge difference and would mean a lot to us. If you'd like to hear a premium extended edition of tonight's and all of our other episodes featuring Twice the Terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can purchase season passes for this podcast and our other quality storytelling programs. Or become a patron for as little as $5 a month and get access to our entire audio archive dating back to 2012, all of it ad-free. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, you can follow and subscribe to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all of our latest updates and new releases and have the chance to interact with us each and every week. You can subscribe to me on YouTube as well at the Otis Jiry channel, where you'll find releases of my series, Horror Storytime, dating back a decade to 2014, and you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, or X, and Instagram too. Just search for Otis Jiry. And as for my neighbor, well, stay tuned.
Good evening to you, and with a tip of my hat, I wish you only the sweetest nightmares.
Until next week, stay spooky and get some sleep, if you can. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's OTIS@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?